The world had never witnessed a trial of such magnitude. Confessions from the Trial Room, German Testimonies before the World's Judgment in World War II captures the raw, unfiltered words of men and women who stood accused of crimes that shocked the conscience of humanity. From the sprawling, high-ceilinged courtrooms of Nuremberg to the quiet, tense interrogations in distant prisons, German officers, bureaucrats, and soldiers revealed secrets that painted a chilling portrait of war, ideology, and obedience. In these testimonies, the machinery of the Third Reich is not merely discussed in abstract. It is humanized in the most unsettling way. Some spoke with denial, masking guilt behind rehearsed narratives. Others admitted complicity with a haunting honesty, yet a few remained eerily indifferent, offering insights into the cold bureaucratic heart of genocide. This narrative is not simply about judgments, sentences, or legal procedures. It is a meticulous exploration of the psyche of individuals swept into the currents of history. The testimonies expose the mechanisms by which ideology and propaganda shaped thought, how ordinary men and women became instruments of extraordinary violence, and how the confrontation with justice forced a reckoning with conscience. It is in this liminal space between self-justification and unavoidable accountability that the human drama unfolds. Through these confessions, historians and readers alike confront a moral abyss. The tension between systemic coercion and personal responsibility, the struggle to reconcile actions with conscience, and the fragile boundaries of obedience and ethical collapse. Confessions from the Trial Room, German Testimonies before the World's Judgment in World War II is a chronicle of reckoning and reflection, where history's most infamous figures face the eyes of the world, and themselves. In their voices, we seek to understand not just what occurred, but why, and how such darkness could emerge from within the fabric of society. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 marked not only the end of a devastating global conflict, but also the beginning of a complex and unprecedented reckoning. Cities lay in ruins. Their skeletal remains testaments to the relentless Allied bombings and the brutal campaigns fought across European soil. The social fabric of the nation had been torn apart. Millions of civilians were displaced, food shortages were severe, and families mourned losses on a scale previously unimaginable. Germany, once the aggressor, now faced occupation and scrutiny by victorious Allied powers whose forces had converged on the defeated nation. The surrender did not merely signal military defeat, it opened a vast political and moral vacuum, a stage upon which questions of justice, culpability, and reconstruction would be fiercely contested. Allied forces divided the nation into occupation zones, each governed by its respective power: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and later, France. Each zone faced its own set of challenges: military governance, denazification, and the restoration of basic infrastructure. Yet all shared the common burden of ensuring that the horrors of the Nazi era would not be repeated. The American zone, for instance, focused on rebuilding democratic institutions and prosecuting high-ranking Nazi officials, while the Soviet zone prioritized control and retribution, often through summary trials and executions. Amidst this fragmented landscape, tensions emerged between the Allies themselves, foreshadowing the ideological divides that would later crystallize into the Cold War. Public outrage in the aftermath of the war was immediate and intense. The revelation of concentration camps, mass graves, and the systematic persecution of Jews, Romani people, political dissidents, and others ignited demands for accountability. Newspapers worldwide printed graphic photographs of liberated camps, making the scale of atrocities undeniable. Ordinary citizens, both within Germany and abroad, demanded that those responsible for these crimes face justice. This moral imperative, combined with the practical need to re-establish international order, catalyzed the emergence of the Nuremberg trials and a network of other tribunals designed to adjudicate war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocide. The Nuremberg trials, formally initiated in November 1945, were envisioned not merely as legal proceedings, but as a historic assertion that state leaders and military commanders could not act with impunity. The defendants encompassed a wide spectrum of roles within the Nazi apparatus. Military leaders, such as field marshals and generals, faced scrutiny for their strategic decisions that led to widespread destruction and civilian deaths. Political officials, including ministers and advisors, were examined for the policies they enacted and the ideological machinery they maintained. Industrialists, whose factories supplied the weapons and infrastructure for war, were interrogated for complicity in forced labor and profiting from conflict. Even lower-level functionaries, who executed orders in bureaucratic offices or concentration camps, were called to answer for their participation in systematic atrocities. The diversity of defendants highlighted the multifaceted nature of Nazi crimes, demonstrating that accountability was required not only at the apex of power but throughout the operational hierarchy. This period also required the world to confront complex questions about guilt and obedience. How much responsibility lay with the individual, and how much could be attributed to systemic coercion or ideological indoctrination? Historians, legal scholars, and psychologists later debated these issues extensively, yet at the time, the courts functioned as the first forum where such moral and legal questions were publicly negotiated. The trials offered meticulous examinations of evidence. Documents, photographs, and eyewitness accounts were presented to establish patterns of planning, implementation, and complicity. This approach sought to dismantle the notion that those accused were mere cogs in an inevitable war machine. Each confession, denial, or justification illuminated the spectrum of human behavior under extreme ideological pressure, ranging from unwavering conviction to abject fear, moral resignation, or cold detachment. The stage was further complicated by political considerations. The Allied powers, while united in the goal of punishing those responsible, often disagreed on the methods and extent of prosecution. The United States emphasized fair trials with adherence to legal norms, aiming to set a precedent for international law. The Soviet Union, still reeling from the immense human and material losses on its front, sought swift and decisive punishments. Britain and France navigated between these approaches, balancing justice with political stabilization. In this crucible, the Nuremberg trials would emerge as a singular experiment in international jurisprudence, blending moral outrage with the procedural rigor necessary to establish credible and lasting judgments. The immediate aftermath of World War II thus set a unique historical stage: a defeated Germany, divided among victorious powers, a world demanding justice, and a legal experiment seeking to reconcile individual accountability with the systemic nature of mass atrocities. Into this environment stepped the first defendants, each bringing with them stories that reflected not only personal choices but the larger machinery of oppression and war. From generals who had directed armies, to bureaucrats who had signed orders in smoke-filled offices, to industrial magnates whose profits had fueled the war machine, the spectrum of those brought to trial underscored the comprehensive nature of accountability. The trials would not only illuminate the moral failures of individuals, but also serve as a mirror to the society that permitted such horrors to unfold. As Germany's surrender settled into the rubble-strewn cities and exhausted populations of post-war Europe, the Allies faced the immense task of determining how to address the crimes committed under the Nazi regime. It was not enough to declare victory and disarm the defeated. There was a moral and legal imperative to establish accountability for acts that had violated every conceivable norm of human decency. This imperative gave birth to the concept of the Nuremberg trials, a groundbreaking experiment in international justice that sought to hold individuals, rather than abstract nations, responsible for the atrocities of war. The very idea of prosecuting state leaders for crimes of this magnitude required unprecedented coordination and collaboration among the victorious powers, each bringing distinct political perspectives and legal traditions to the table. The planning for the trials began almost immediately after the cessation of hostilities, with the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France negotiating both the scope and procedural framework of the proceedings. Representatives from each Allied power contributed to drafting the London Charter, which established the tribunal's legal foundation. This process demanded compromise. The Americans emphasized adherence to legal norms and due process. The Soviets, scarred by enormous losses on the Eastern Front, pressed for swift retribution and broad interpretations of guilt. The British advocated a balance between fairness and moral clarity, and the French sought recognition of their contribution to the fight against Nazism while asserting their own legal philosophies. Through these negotiations, the tribunal achieved a delicate balance. It would be internationally legitimate while remaining committed to both moral and procedural rigor. One of the most revolutionary aspects of the Nuremberg trials was their legal innovation. The tribunal codified three distinct categories of crimes: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Crimes against peace addressed the planning, initiation, or waging of wars of aggression, acts that had previously been difficult to prosecute under existing international law. War crimes encompassed violations of established conventions, such as the mistreatment of prisoners of war, the targeting of civilians, and the destruction of property. Crimes against humanity, perhaps the most morally resonant of all, included mass murder, enslavement, persecution, and deportation of civilians, particularly targeting groups defined by race, religion, or political affiliation. By establishing these categories, the tribunal set a precedent that extended legal responsibility beyond national borders and created a framework for evaluating individual culpability within complex systems of power. The selection of judges, prosecutors, and legal teams further reflected the international character and ambition of the trials. Judges were appointed from each of the four Allied powers, bringing with them distinct legal traditions: common law from the United Kingdom and the United States, civil law from France, and Soviet legal principles. Their task was to navigate a court structure that blended these traditions into a coherent framework, balancing the need for rigorous evidence with the unprecedented nature of the charges. Prosecutors, led by figures such as Robert H. Jackson from the United States, faced the daunting challenge of presenting a coherent case against a diverse group of defendants, ranging from high-ranking military officials to bureaucrats and industrialists. Legal teams were tasked not only with preparing arguments but also with coordinating international evidence, ensuring that witness testimony from liberated camps, destroyed cities, and occupied territories could be compiled and presented credibly. Gathering evidence and testimony posed one of the most significant challenges in the preparation of the trials. The scale of the crimes, the dislocation of populations, and the destruction of records demanded extraordinary ingenuity. Prosecutors relied on captured German documents, meticulous records maintained by the Nazi bureaucracy, and eyewitness accounts from survivors of concentration camps, forced labor, and occupied territories. In many cases, evidence was found in burned-out offices, hidden repositories, or in the memory of traumatized witnesses whose recollections were both precious and fragile. Coordinating this information across multiple languages, legal systems, and logistical hurdles was a monumental task, requiring not only legal acumen but also diplomacy and patience. The meticulous documentation of crimes became a central component of the tribunal's authority, establishing a historical record that would inform generations of legal and moral discourse. The trials also grappled with profound philosophical and legal questions, many of which had never been addressed in international law. Could individuals be held accountable for actions that were technically legal under their national legislation at the time? What was the moral responsibility of those who claimed to simply follow orders? The tribunal established the principle that obedience to orders did not absolve personal responsibility, setting a precedent that challenged deeply ingrained notions of hierarchical authority. These deliberations reflected a broader tension: the need to balance justice with fairness, punishment with due process, and the moral outrage of the world with the technical demands of law. In doing so, the Nuremberg trials became a laboratory for international jurisprudence, demonstrating that the legal system could confront crimes of unprecedented scale without sacrificing legitimacy or credibility. The significance of the Nuremberg trials extended far beyond the immediate punishment of the defendants. They represented a turning point in the development of post-war international law, establishing enduring principles that would influence the creation of later institutions, including the International Criminal Court and tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. By codifying crimes against humanity, the tribunal asserted that there existed universal standards of justice to which all nations and individuals were accountable. This legal innovation underscored the notion that sovereignty did not grant immunity from scrutiny, and that moral and legal norms transcended borders. Furthermore, the meticulous records, witness testimonies, and judicial opinions produced during the trials provided a foundation for historical understanding, offering scholars, policymakers, and future generations a detailed account of how ideology, bureaucracy, and obedience combined to enable mass atrocities. The creation of the Nuremberg trials thus represents a convergence of practical necessity, moral imperative, and visionary legal thinking. They were designed to confront the full spectrum of Nazi criminality, from military aggression to industrial complicity, and to establish a historical and legal record that could neither be ignored nor forgotten. In bringing together diverse legal traditions, assembling comprehensive evidence, and articulating unprecedented legal principles, the Allies forged a tribunal that would not only judge the past but also influence the future. The trial's creation and purpose were inseparable. They were a statement of moral authority, a demonstration of international cooperation, and a landmark in the evolution of global justice. As the Nuremberg trials moved from conception to execution, the focus shifted from legal principles and procedural innovations to the individuals who had played pivotal roles in constructing, maintaining, and executing the Nazi regime. The defendants represented a cross-section of German society, from the highest echelons of political and military power to the lower-ranking bureaucrats who had implemented policies of persecution with chilling efficiency. Each figure carried with them not only a dossier of actions and decisions, but also a complex web of ideology, personal loyalty, and psychological rationalization that the court sought to unravel. Among the most prominent of these figures was Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal and one of Hitler's closest confidants. Göring had risen through the ranks of the Nazi Party to become a symbol of the regime's blend of charisma, opportunism, and ruthless ambition. As commander of the Luftwaffe and head of the four-year plan, he wielded immense authority over both military operations and economic mobilization, consolidating power in a manner that blurred the lines between state and party. At his arrest, Göring exhibited a mixture of bravado and calculated charm, confident that his status and reputation might shield him from accountability. Yet, during interrogations and trial proceedings, his carefully cultivated persona began to crack, revealing both a deep-seated ambition and a troubling capacity for denial. Despite overwhelming evidence of his complicity in mass murder and forced labor programs, Göring frequently framed his actions as service to Germany, illustrating the complex interplay between personal justification and ideological loyalty that characterized many high-ranking defendants. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, presented a strikingly different profile. Hess's flight to Scotland in 1941, an attempt to negotiate peace independently, had already marked him as a figure of both intrigue and isolation within the Nazi hierarchy. At Nuremberg, Hess appeared detached and disoriented, offering testimony that reflected a mixture of ideological conviction and apparent disconnection from the practical realities of governance. Unlike Göring, Hess's defense leaned heavily on claims of personal loyalty to Hitler rather than active participation in criminal policies, highlighting the spectrum of culpability within the upper ranks. His presence at the trials emphasized not only the diversity of personalities within the Nazi elite, but also the challenges faced by prosecutors in distinguishing between ideological devotion and direct criminal responsibility. Albert Speer, the so-called Nazi architect and Minister of Armaments and War Production, introduced yet another dimension to the tribunal's examination of individual responsibility. Speer was notable for his calculated willingness to acknowledge certain aspects of his role while simultaneously distancing himself from the most egregious atrocities. His testimony demonstrated both an acute awareness of the historical moment and a sophisticated attempt to navigate moral culpability, portraying himself as a technocrat caught in the machinery of power rather than as an ideologue actively shaping genocidal policies. This strategy, acknowledgement without full admission, would become one of the most discussed aspects of the trials, illustrating how defendants sought to reconcile personal survival, historical memory, and legal accountability. Beyond these prominent figures, the tribunal also confronted an array of defendants whose crimes were less publicly renowned but equally instructive for understanding the operation of the Nazi state. Military commanders, such as Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, exemplified the tension between obedience to orders and personal responsibility. Keitel's defense often relied on the argument that he had merely executed directives from superiors, reflecting the broader cultural ethos of hierarchical loyalty and discipline within the German military. Prosecutors countered this claim by presenting extensive documentation demonstrating that individuals in positions of authority possessed discretion, knowledge of criminal intent, and the capacity to resist unlawful commands. Through Keitel and others, the trials examined the fine line between institutional obedience and personal moral accountability, exposing the extent to which bureaucratic compliance enabled mass atrocities. The defendants also included a significant number of ordinary bureaucrats and functionaries whose roles, while less visible, were essential to the implementation of the regime's policies. Figures like Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Main Security Office, demonstrated how administrative expertise could be weaponized in the service of ideology. These individuals often operated behind the scenes, coordinating deportations, managing concentration camp logistics, or ensuring the efficient functioning of oppressive systems. Their testimonies revealed the banal mechanisms through which atrocities were carried out, emphasizing Hannah Arendt's later concept of the banality of evil, the idea that ordinary people, through procedural efficiency and detachment, could become enablers of mass murder. Contrasts between these functionaries and high-ranking officials like Göring or Speer highlighted the spectrum of agency and moral choice within the Nazi hierarchy, illustrating that culpability was not confined to the top echelons but permeated every level of governance. Personal ideologies and claims of loyalty to Hitler played a crucial role in shaping the narratives presented during the trials. Many defendants framed their actions within the context of absolute allegiance to the Führer, portraying themselves as instruments of a greater national mission rather than independent actors capable of moral judgment. This strategy served multiple purposes. It sought to mitigate legal responsibility, to preserve personal honor within a subculture that valued loyalty above all, and to appeal to the tribunal's understanding of the pressures of ideological conformity. At the same time, prosecutors were careful to demonstrate that loyalty, while pervasive, could not justify the perpetration of crimes against humanity, reinforcing the principle that moral and legal responsibility could not be suspended by hierarchical obedience. The spectrum of defendants also allowed observers to examine the psychological dimensions of complicity. High-ranking officials often displayed a mixture of arrogance, denial, and strategic self-preservation, while lower-ranking functionaries frequently revealed fear, resignation, or mechanized detachment. The contrast between figures like Göring, who actively courted the attention of the court, and the silent, bureaucratic operators behind mass deportations underscored the diversity of human responses to participation in atrocity. It also illuminated the varied moral landscapes in which these individuals operated, offering a nuanced understanding of how ideology, ambition, and socialization intersected to produce catastrophic outcomes. The trials, in presenting these profiles, effectively created a mosaic of responsibility. Each defendant represented a unique intersection of opportunity, choice, and ideology, demonstrating that the machinery of the Nazi state depended on a complex interplay of personalities, skills, and moral compromises. This approach allowed the tribunal not only to assign legal responsibility, but also to construct a historical record that would help future generations understand the mechanisms by which ordinary and extraordinary individuals contributed to one of history's most devastating conflicts. The careful study of these profiles also highlighted enduring questions about human behavior under authoritarian systems. Why do some individuals comply unquestioningly, while others resist or attempt to mitigate harm? How do personal ambition, fear, and ideological conviction shape decisions in environments where moral and legal norms have been systematically undermined? By juxtaposing the actions, defenses, and testimonies of high-ranking officials and ordinary functionaries, the trials revealed patterns of complicity that were neither uniform nor entirely predictable, underscoring the complexity of accountability in situations of mass violence. Through the detailed examination of Göring, Hess, Speer, and countless others, the tribunal illuminated the inner workings of the Nazi state while simultaneously probing the boundaries of individual responsibility. Each profile, whether of an architect of genocide or a bureaucrat facilitating it, offered insight into the motivations, rationalizations, and psychological mechanisms that allowed atrocities to occur on an unprecedented scale. The careful documentation of these personal narratives ensured that the trials would serve not only as instruments of justice, but also as historical testimony, preserving the memory of both the crimes committed and the moral dilemmas faced by those who perpetrated them. By presenting a spectrum of defendants, from the charismatic and manipulative to the silent and compliant, the Nuremberg trials underscored a fundamental truth. The machinery of atrocity is sustained not only by ideology and leadership, but by the willing or coerced participation of countless individuals. Understanding these profiles provides crucial context for interpreting the testimonies that followed, offering a lens through which the world could comprehend not merely the scale of Nazi crimes, but the human factors that enabled them. It is in this space, between history, psychology, and law, that the trial's most enduring insights emerge, revealing the fragile boundary between obedience, ambition, and moral collapse. Once the defendants were formally brought into the Nuremberg courtroom, the process of unraveling the web of their actions began with intensive interrogations. These initial sessions were designed not merely to gather facts, but to pierce the carefully constructed defenses that each individual had cultivated over years of power, privilege, and ideological reinforcement. Psychological pressure played a central role in this early phase. Interrogators, aware of both the stakes and the personalities involved, employed strategies ranging from persistent questioning and exposure to irrefutable documentary evidence, to appeals to conscience and moral reflection. The very environment of the courtroom, a combination of strict procedural formality and global scrutiny, exacerbated the tension, forcing defendants into the difficult position of reconciling personal survival with the inexorable weight of historical judgment. Partial confessions emerged quickly among some of the defendants. Albert Speer, for example, acknowledged his role in exploiting forced labor while carefully attempting to distance himself from direct involvement in extermination programs. His statements reflected both strategic self-preservation and a conscious effort to project a moral hierarchy within the Nazi leadership, implying that culpability was concentrated among those at the very top. In contrast, Hermann Göring's early statements were characterized by deflection, bravado, and selective admission, revealing a man attempting to maintain a public persona of command even in the face of irrefutable evidence. These partial confessions, while sometimes revealing fragments of truth, also introduced contradictions, requiring prosecutors to carefully compare testimony against documents, eyewitness accounts, and prior statements. Denials were equally prominent, with some defendants asserting ignorance of mass atrocities or claiming that orders were merely administrative rather than criminal. Rudolf Hess, whose earlier flight to Scotland already complicated his public image, frequently presented himself as a loyal party member whose actions were dictated entirely by allegiance to Hitler. His attempts to portray himself as peripheral to criminal decision-making illustrate the challenges faced by the prosecution in demonstrating the interconnectedness of Nazi policies, the chain of command, and personal responsibility. Even when denials appeared straightforward, careful analysis revealed subtle admissions of knowledge, underscoring the complex interplay between legal strategy, ideology, and self-perception. Documentary evidence played an indispensable role in challenging the narratives constructed by defendants. Orders bearing official signatures, meticulous records of troop movements, construction schedules for concentration camps, and photographs documenting atrocities provided a foundation of indisputable facts against which every statement was measured. Diaries, memos, and correspondences revealed intentions, approvals, and communications that directly implicated individuals in the orchestration of mass violence. Prosecutors meticulously cross-referenced these materials with witness testimony, creating an evidence network that could not easily be dismissed. This rigorous approach highlighted the tension between subjective recollection and objective documentation, exposing inconsistencies in defendants' accounts and gradually breaking down carefully crafted defenses. The emotional and moral responses of the defendants were a focal point of observation. Some exhibited visible guilt, acknowledging actions with trembling voices or downcast eyes, as if the realization of historical judgment forced them into a confrontation with conscience. Others displayed fear, anticipating both legal consequences and the moral condemnation of history. Yet a distinct pattern emerged in many cases: attempts at justification, often framed in terms of duty, loyalty, or coercion. Defendants repeatedly argued that refusal to comply would have resulted in personal jeopardy or, alternatively, that their participation was merely one element in a much larger bureaucratic system. These responses illuminate not only individual psychology, but also the broader societal conditioning that allowed ordinary citizens to participate in extraordinary crimes. Many testimonies provided vivid illustrations of complicity and what later scholars would term the banality of evil. Functionaries responsible for the logistical implementation of deportations or mass killings often recounted their actions in matter-of-fact terms, as if they were executing routine administrative tasks rather than participating in crimes against humanity. For example, transport officers described coordinating train schedules for the deportation of thousands without expressing overt emotional response, demonstrating the mechanization of moral disengagement. These accounts revealed that the efficiency of the Nazi machinery depended not solely on high-level policy directives, but on the disciplined execution of mundane tasks by individuals who had normalized their participation. Contradictions and partial truths frequently emerged in the interplay between defendants' statements and evidence. Göring's insistence on presenting himself as a strategic military leader conflicted with documentary proof of his direct involvement in orchestrating the plundering of occupied territories and the exploitation of forced labor. Speer's selective acknowledgement of responsibility stood in tension with records indicating his knowledge of the conditions in concentration and labor camps. Even those who appeared honest, such as Hess, revealed through subtle admissions or discrepancies that a full understanding of the chain of command and operational knowledge was unavoidable. These contradictions offered crucial insight into how ideology, ambition, and fear intertwined to shape human behavior under extreme political conditions. The trials also highlighted the moral tension between individual conscience and collective responsibility. Many defendants, when confronted with evidence of civilian suffering or systemic extermination, attempted to reconcile their actions with an overarching loyalty to the Reich. Some insisted they were following orders, others claimed ignorance of the broader consequences. This struggle underscores a central lesson of the Confessions, that the path from obedience to atrocity is neither linear nor inevitable, but emerges from a complex negotiation between personal morality, socialization, and institutional pressure. The tribunal's insistence on examining these factors in detail created a space in which accountability was measured not only in legal terms, but in moral and historical dimensions. Witness testimony further reinforced the human impact of defendants' actions. Survivors of concentration camps, forced labor programs, and occupied territories provided harrowing accounts of experiences that directly contradicted the sanitized narratives of defendants. These testimonies underscored the scale and immediacy of the crimes, while also giving voice to those who had been denied power and agency during the Nazi era. When juxtaposed with the calm, sometimes detached accounts of perpetrators, these stories amplified the contrast between administrative efficiency and human suffering, highlighting the psychological mechanisms of dehumanization, normalization, and bureaucratic detachment. Over the course of these first confessions, a pattern emerged. Even in partial admissions, denials, or deflections, the defendants revealed the mechanisms by which mass atrocities were planned and executed. The tribunal, through careful cross-examination and corroboration with documentary evidence, began to reconstruct not only the events themselves, but the psychological and organizational structures that facilitated them. By probing loyalty, ideology, and personal rationalizations, The early sessions of the trials illuminated the spectrum of human behavior, from cold, calculated participation to reluctant compliance, and offered insights into how ordinary and extraordinary individuals could contribute to acts of immense moral and legal transgression. The first confessions, therefore, were more than legal maneuvers. They were windows into the minds of those who had perpetrated unprecedented crimes. Through admissions, contradictions, and moral grappling, the defendants exposed both the efficiency of the Nazi system and the ethical collapse of those who sustained it. These testimonies laid the groundwork for the tribunal's judgments, providing both the factual and psychological context necessary to understand the full scope of responsibility. The interplay of fear, justification, guilt, and denial revealed in these early confessions would resonate throughout the trial, offering historians, legal scholars, and the public enduring lessons about human capacity for both complicity and moral reflection. As the Nuremberg proceedings moved beyond the initial confessions of defendants, the tribunal turned its focus toward the concrete manifestations of the crimes committed under the Nazi regime. The testimony of witnesses, documents, and even photographs provided a harrowing window into the scope and scale of human suffering. Unlike legal arguments or ideological rationalizations, these testimonies offered visceral, first-hand accounts that illuminated the consequences of policy and command, bringing to light atrocities that could not be denied or ignored. In these sessions, the machinery of genocide, war, and oppression was revealed not as abstract bureaucracy, but as a series of deliberate actions executed by individuals at every level of the Nazi hierarchy. One of the central themes that emerged in these testimonies was the systematic nature of mass executions and the operation of concentration camps. Witnesses described in chilling detail the daily routines of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Bergen-Belsen, recounting the arrival of trains filled with men, women, and children, the immediate segregation based on perceived utility or threat, and the rapid processing that determined life or death. Personal recollections often emphasized the impersonal efficiency of the system. Individuals who had once been neighbors, teachers, or artisans were reduced to numbers, stripped of clothing, and subjected to labor, starvation, or execution with methodical precision. In these accounts, the defendants' earlier rationalizations, obedience, loyalty, or ignorance, were starkly contrasted with the undeniable reality of suffering, creating an unflinching record of the human cost of administrative compliance. Forced labor camps also featured prominently in the testimonies, revealing the industrial and economic dimensions of the Nazi war machine. Testifiers recounted the grueling conditions under which prisoners were compelled to work in factories producing munitions, armaments, and infrastructure critical to the war effort. These accounts highlighted both the physical brutality inflicted on laborers and the calculated exploitation that maximized productivity at the expense of human life. Engineers, industrial managers, and bureaucrats who oversaw these operations were often implicated by documentation and testimony alike, exposing the ways in which ordinary administrative tasks were transformed into instruments of coercion and dehumanization. These narratives underscored a central theme. Atrocities were not solely the product of battlefield violence, but depended on the collaboration of the state, the military, and industry to function effectively. Military operations leading to civilian massacres further illustrated the intersection of policy and practice in the perpetration of war crimes. Testimonies from occupied territories described instances where orders from high command resulted in indiscriminate killings, mass deportations, and the deliberate targeting of civilian populations. The systematic nature of such operations became evident through survivor accounts and captured records, showing that these acts were neither accidental nor spontaneous, but planned, coordinated, and justified under the ideological framework of the regime. Commanders, often present in these testimonies, attempted to distance themselves from responsibility, claiming they were executing orders or acting within the accepted rules of warfare. The tribunal's cross-examinations, however, revealed that these claims were frequently contradicted by evidence of knowledge, discretion, and participation, highlighting the deliberate choices that underpinned mass violence. The industrial and logistical support for genocidal policies was particularly striking. Witnesses described the role of railways in transporting victims to extermination camps, the procurement of supplies necessary for the operation of gas chambers and crematoria, and the bureaucratic precision with which records of deportation and death were maintained. Testimonies often emphasized the complicity of ostensibly neutral professionals, engineers, clerks, accountants, whose work facilitated the systematic destruction of human life. These accounts revealed that the Nazi regime's capacity for atrocity depended on the integration of administrative skill, technical expertise, and ideological commitment, demonstrating that genocide was a coordinated effort requiring both policy and execution at multiple levels of society. Personal recollections from survivors frequently highlighted the moral conflicts faced by both perpetrators and victims. Witnesses described acts of small resistance, moments of compassion, and the desperate choices made in the shadow of annihilation. Equally, they recounted instances of indifference or complicity, where ordinary individuals participated in cruelty or remained passive in the face of suffering. These narratives provided a nuanced view of human behavior under extreme conditions, showing that moral choices were often constrained by fear, indoctrination, or self-interest. The testimonies underscored the complexity of culpability, illustrating that while the legal framework focused on individual responsibility, the lived experience of atrocity involved layers of coercion, persuasion, and survival instincts. Variations in tone among defendants became especially apparent when confronted with these detailed accounts. Some, when faced with evidence of mass killings or deportations, sought to minimize their involvement, deny knowledge, or attribute responsibility to superiors. Others acknowledged their actions with varying degrees of remorse, offering explanations that ranged from technical necessity to ideological conviction. The contrast between denial and full acknowledgement highlighted the psychological mechanisms by which individuals justified participation in extreme violence. It also underscored the moral and legal challenge of the tribunal, to differentiate between self-serving rationalizations and genuine admissions of culpability, and to measure accountability against both law and conscience. Several testimonies illustrated the chilling banality of evil, a concept later articulated by scholars observing the trials. Individuals who had performed routine administrative tasks, maintaining transport schedules, recording arrivals and departures, issuing permits, often described their work in neutral, bureaucratic terms, as if it had no moral weight. Yet these seemingly mundane actions directly facilitated mass murder and enslavement. By juxtaposing the impersonal language of official records with the stark reality of survivor testimony, the tribunal exposed the mechanisms through which ordinary work could become an instrument of extraordinary evil. These accounts reinforced the notion that systematic atrocities require not only ideological commitment, but also the procedural compliance of countless ordinary actors. Eyewitness accounts from liberated camps were particularly poignant in conveying the human dimension of these crimes. Survivors described the physical and psychological toll of sustained abuse, the pervasive fear and uncertainty, and the strategies employed to maintain a semblance of survival. In cross-examination, these accounts often clashed with defendants' claims of ignorance or detachment, providing irrefutable evidence of knowledge and complicity. Testimonies recounted specific incidents, executions, medical experiments, starvation, that highlighted the intersection of ideology, authority, and human suffering, making abstract legal definitions tangible and immediate. The tribunals also revealed the deliberate bureaucratic sophistication underlying Nazi atrocities. Documents submitted as evidence demonstrated meticulous planning, deportation schedules, resource allocations, and statistical tracking of human lives. Witnesses often commented on the precision with which these systems operated, reflecting a calculated, methodical approach to genocide. Defendants' attempts to portray themselves as uninvolved or merely following orders were consistently challenged by this documentary record, illustrating that complicity was both widespread and systematically integrated into the operations of the state. Through these testimonies, the Nuremberg trials presented a multidimensional view of atrocity. They captured the scale of violence, the procedural mechanisms that enabled it, and the personal dimensions of moral engagement and disengagement. Denial, justification, and acknowledgement coexisted within the courtroom, revealing the psychological complexity of those who had participated in mass crimes. These sessions underscored a fundamental truth, that atrocities are rarely the product of a single actor or moment, but the outcome of coordinated systems, reinforced by ideology, bureaucracy, and social norms. By documenting the experiences of both victims and perpetrators, the tribunal established a lasting historical record. The combination of survivor testimony, documentary evidence, and defendants' confessions created a comprehensive narrative of the Holocaust and related war crimes. This body of evidence not only enabled the assignment of legal responsibility, but also provided the world with an enduring understanding of how ordinary and extraordinary human actions can converge to produce catastrophic outcomes. The witnesses' accounts, vivid in detail and varied in tone, illuminated both the operational and moral dimensions of the Nazi regime. From the meticulous organization of death camps to the individual choices of perpetrators, these testimonies highlighted the mechanisms of systemic violence and the complex psychology underlying complicity. As such, they became a crucial element in the tribunal's broader mission, to confront humanity with the full reality of atrocity, to establish accountability, and to lay the groundwork for a moral and legal reckoning that would resonate far beyond the courtroom. The testimonies and confessions of defendants at Nuremberg revealed more than the factual record of atrocities. They offered profound insight into the psychological mechanisms that facilitated mass participation in crimes of unprecedented scale. Central to this understanding was the role of Nazi ideology, which provided both a moral framework and a practical justification for actions that, in any ordinary context, would have been recognized as monstrous. From the earliest stages of indoctrination, individuals were immersed in a worldview that emphasized racial hierarchy, national destiny, and absolute loyalty to the Führer. This ideological conditioning shaped perceptions, distorted moral reasoning, and created a lens through which war crimes could be rationalized or dismissed as necessary for the greater good. Defendants frequently articulated this ideological influence during their testimonies. Albert Speer, for instance, acknowledged the pervasive nature of Nazi propaganda and the normalization of extreme measures, describing a climate in which dissent was virtually unthinkable. High-ranking military officials, such as Wilhelm Keitel, similarly invoked the concept of duty and loyalty, presenting their actions as service to the state rather than personal choices. Even bureaucrats and lower-level functionaries, who were not formally trained in political theory, absorbed the regime's messaging, demonstrating how ideology penetrated everyday life and institutional structures. These statements highlighted a crucial point. The Nazi worldview was not merely abstract. It was operationalized, internalized, and reinforced through social, political, and professional networks, shaping the moral compass of those who executed its policies. Ideology functioned as a mechanism of moral justification, allowing defendants to reinterpret acts of violence as legitimate, even virtuous, within the framework of the regime. Testimonies often referenced the dehumanization of victims, particularly Jews, Romani people, and political dissidents, as a way to rationalize participation in mass murder or deportation. By portraying these groups as existential threats or societal parasites, defendants recast criminal acts as defensive or necessary. Göring's early confessions, for example, invoked notions of national survival and ideological necessity, illustrating how deeply indoctrinated perspectives could mediate perceptions of guilt. The moral lens provided by ideology thus served as a psychological shield, enabling individuals to reconcile actions that would otherwise provoke conscience and legal culpability. Obedience to authority emerged as a second, reinforcing mechanism in shaping behavior. Across testimonies, a pattern consistent with what later psychologists would recognize in Milgram's experiments became evident. Individuals complied with orders from perceived legitimate authority figures, even when those orders entailed the perpetration of extreme violence. Field Marshal Keitel, when questioned about directives leading to civilian massacres, repeatedly emphasized that his role was to execute commands, highlighting the prioritization of hierarchical obedience over independent moral judgment. Similarly, many mid-level bureaucrats describe their work in concentration camp administration or transportation logistics as dutiful execution of orders, rationalizing their complicity by framing themselves as cogs in an impersonal system. These accounts underscored the capacity of social and institutional structures to normalize compliance and suppress ethical reflection. Psychological pressure and systemic coercion were not limited to explicit threats of punishment. They also operated through subtle mechanisms of social conformity and professional expectation. Within the Nazi bureaucracy and military, individuals were evaluated by their loyalty, efficiency, and ideological commitment. Deviating from orders or questioning directives risked social ostracism, career stagnation, or, in extreme cases, lethal reprisal. Testimonies revealed that even individuals with moral reservations frequently prioritized self-preservation and social cohesion over ethical action, highlighting the complex interplay between external coercion and internalized norms. This dynamic helps explain the widespread participation in atrocities, even among those who later expressed horror or regret for their actions. The psychological process of rationalization often involved compartmentalization, allowing defendants to separate professional responsibilities from moral considerations. Engineers, clerks, and camp administrators frequently describe their work in technical, depersonalized terms, avoiding engagement with the human consequences of their decisions. For example, railway officials overseeing the transport of deportees discussed scheduling and efficiency without reference to the suffering of the passengers, demonstrating a functional detachment that facilitated systemic compliance. These patterns, evident across multiple testimonies, illustrate the convergence of ideology, bureaucratic structure, and cognitive mechanisms in sustaining participation in mass crimes. Some defendants displayed conscious awareness of the moral tension inherent in their actions, revealing the limits of indoctrination and the persistence of personal conscience. Albert Speer, while acknowledging technical responsibility, emphasized his supposed ignorance of extermination activities, suggesting selective moral engagement. Others, like Rudolf Hess, appeared ideologically insulated, interpreting loyalty to Hitler as a sufficient moral justification despite the catastrophic consequences. These contrasts reveal the diversity of psychological responses to authority and indoctrination, emphasizing that obedience and ideology operated on a spectrum, shaped by individual personality, social context, and opportunity for reflection. Testimonies also illustrated the interplay between fear and moral choice. Lower-ranking functionaries frequently invoked fear of reprisal or social condemnation as factors shaping compliance. Yet in numerous cases, evidence demonstrated that individuals retained discretion and the capacity for resistance, suggesting that systemic coercion could not fully absolve personal responsibility. The tribunal grappled with these nuances, emphasizing that obedience, while pervasive, was not an absolute shield from accountability. By exploring these dynamics, the trials revealed that the psychology of defendants was inseparable from the legal and moral frameworks being applied, highlighting the intricate connection between individual cognition, social pressure, and systemic evil. Furthermore, the trials offered insight into the cognitive dissonance experienced by defendants when confronted with undeniable evidence of atrocities. Some expressed shock or disbelief when documents, photographs, and survivor testimonies contradicted their self-perception, illustrating how ideological conditioning could distort understanding of one's own actions. Others attempted to rationalize inconsistencies by claiming selective ignorance or emphasizing the moral authority of orders. These psychological strategies reveal the mechanisms by which individuals negotiate guilt and preserve self-identity in the context of moral transgression, offering enduring lessons for understanding human behavior in extreme environments. The psychological profile emerging from these testimonies underscores the interdependent roles of ideology and authority in facilitating mass crimes. Defendants' reliance on Nazi belief systems, combined with hierarchical obedience and social pressure, created conditions in which ordinary individuals could participate in extraordinary atrocities. Yet the testimonies also reveal the presence of moral agency, even in constrained environments, illustrating that systemic coercion and indoctrination could not entirely suppress individual judgment. The Nuremberg proceedings thus provided a unique opportunity to examine the cognitive, social, and ethical dimensions of participation in organized violence, offering insights that extend beyond historical context to broader questions of human behavior under authoritarian regimes. By connecting ideological indoctrination with observed patterns of obedience, the trials illuminated how belief systems and social structures interact to produce moral disengagement. Defendants' confessions and denials, set against the backdrop of documentary evidence and survivor testimony, allowed the tribunal to trace the pathways by which ordinary and extraordinary individuals rationalize participation in acts of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. These insights, grounded in rigorous examination of first-hand accounts, offered a deeper understanding of the psychological foundations of complicity, demonstrating that ideology and authority function together to shape perception, decision-making, and moral judgment. Ultimately, the exploration of ideology and obedience in the Nuremberg testimonies reveals the fragile boundary between personal choice and systemic coercion. While Nazi indoctrination and hierarchical structures facilitated participation in mass atrocities, the evidence also confirms that individuals retained moral responsibility and the capacity for independent judgment. The tribunal's careful examination of these dynamics contributed not only to the legal adjudication of guilt, but also to a broader understanding of the psychological mechanisms underpinning mass violence, offering lessons that resonate in contexts far beyond the specific historical moment. As the Nuremberg trials progressed, a clear pattern emerged in the strategies adopted by defendants to navigate the legal and moral gauntlet before them. The psychological insights revealed in prior sections, particularly the roles of ideology, indoctrination, and obedience, intersected directly with the defenses these individuals mounted. Many sought to reduce their perceived culpability by framing their actions within the narrowest possible conception of personal responsibility, relying on a combination of legal argumentation, selective acknowledgement, and moral rationalization. The courtroom thus became not only a site of factual inquiry, but also a stage for carefully constructed narratives intended to preserve honor, evade accountability, or shape historical memory. The most ubiquitous defense strategy was the invocation of following orders, a claim rooted in the hierarchical structure of the Nazi regime. Military officers, bureaucrats, and functionaries frequently argued that their actions were dictated by superior commands, rendering them incapable of independent moral judgment. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel exemplified this approach, consistently emphasizing that his role was execution rather than initiative, framing obedience as both a duty and a necessity. Similarly, mid-level officers and administrative personnel invoked the chain of command, arguing that refusal to comply with directives could have resulted in personal jeopardy, professional ruin, or even death. These assertions highlighted the tension between legal and moral accountability. While hierarchical obedience was socially and institutionally reinforced, the tribunal sought to establish that such compliance did not absolve individuals of responsibility for crimes against humanity. Claims of ignorance or non-involvement formed a second prominent line of defense. Several defendants, particularly those whose work involved bureaucratic or logistical tasks, insisted that they were unaware of the broader consequences of their actions. Albert Speer, for example, admitted responsibility for armaments production but claimed ignorance of extermination activities, portraying himself as a technocrat insulated from the moral implications of his work. Others argued that their positions were sufficiently remote from the planning or execution of atrocities that culpability was minimal or non-existent. These claims required careful scrutiny, as prosecutors meticulously cross-referenced documentary evidence, eyewitness testimony, and operational records to demonstrate knowledge and complicity. The interplay between claimed ignorance and documented awareness became a central point of tension, revealing both the limitations of self-justification and the tribunal's determination to hold individuals accountable regardless of perceived distance from criminal acts. Another common strategy involved attempts to shift blame onto superiors or circumstances. Defendants frequently portrayed themselves as instruments in a broader system, emphasizing that ultimate responsibility rested with Hitler, high-ranking party officials, or the institutional apparatus of the Third Reich. Göring, for instance, often deflected attention toward other members of the leadership, framing his actions as consistent with collective decision-making rather than individual initiative. Bureaucrats overseeing deportations or labor allocation similarly argued that policies were formulated at higher levels, and that they were constrained by operational necessity. These narratives sought to recast personal agency as subordinate to structural pressures, a tactic that underscored the moral and legal complexity inherent in evaluating responsibility within a vast and hierarchical organization. The defense strategies were further shaped by the active roles of lawyers, who acted as both legal advocates and public interpreters of guilt. Defense counsel sought to contextualize actions within the chaotic environment of war, emphasizing the challenges of decision-making under duress, the demands of obedience, and the ideological pressures of the regime. In some cases, lawyers framed their clients as scapegoats or victims of circumstance, appealing to the tribunal's sense of fairness while also attempting to influence public perception. Media coverage of the trials, amplified by press releases and courtroom reporting, meant that these defense narratives reached audiences far beyond Nuremberg, shaping early historical interpretations of culpability and resistance. The interplay between legal argumentation and public perception thus became a critical dimension of the trial, highlighting the performative aspect of defense strategies in addition to their formal legal function. Denials of direct involvement were often intertwined with partial admissions of responsibility, creating a complex and sometimes contradictory narrative landscape. Defendants might acknowledge participation in logistical tasks or administrative oversight, while simultaneously denying awareness of the ultimate consequences of their actions. These nuanced positions required prosecutors to pass testimony with great precision, corroborating statements against documentary evidence and witness accounts. The contradictions themselves became significant, as they often revealed underlying attempts to minimize moral culpability while maintaining credibility before the court. Such strategies reflected a careful balancing act. Defendants sought to preserve personal dignity and mitigate punishment while avoiding overt lies that could be disproven by irrefutable evidence. Psychological factors played a central role in shaping the content and tone of these defense strategies. Many defendants displayed cognitive mechanisms such as rationalization, compartmentalization, and selective memory, which allowed them to reconcile participation in atrocities with self-perception as honorable or dutiful individuals. Göring's bravado, Speer's calculated acknowledgement, and Keitel's emphasis on obedience illustrate how individuals deployed both conscious and unconscious strategies to preserve identity in the face of moral and legal scrutiny. These behaviors underscore the complexity of human psychology in extreme environments, revealing the interplay between ideological indoctrination, systemic coercion, and self-preservation. The tribunal, in evaluating these defenses, confronted profound philosophical and legal questions about the limits of justification. Could following orders, ignorance, or structural constraints excuse participation in mass atrocities? To what extent did moral choice persist in contexts of extreme authority and coercion? Prosecutors repeatedly emphasized that individuals retained agency, even within hierarchical and ideologically saturated systems, and that legal accountability could not be nullified by appeals to obedience or circumstance. The careful dissection of defense strategies thus served not only to establish guilt, but also to articulate enduring principles of international law and moral responsibility. Variations in the effectiveness of defense strategies were also evident across different types of defendants. High-ranking officials, whose roles were widely documented and publicized, faced challenges in asserting ignorance or obedience, as extensive records and witness testimonies substantiated direct involvement. Mid-level officers and functionaries, while potentially more insulated from policy formulation, were scrutinized for their participation in execution and logistical operations. The tribunal's systematic approach ensured that no claim of innocence went unexamined, balancing procedural fairness with the imperative to confront systemic criminality. The public dimension of these defense strategies cannot be understated. The trials were widely reported, and defense narratives shaped contemporary understanding of guilt and responsibility. Lawyers strategically framed clients in ways that resonated with notions of honor, duty, and national context, creating a counterpoint to the prosecution's focus on criminality and moral outrage. In doing so, they participated in the broader historical narrative, influencing both immediate perceptions and long-term historiography of the Nazi regime and its functionaries. Ultimately, the defense strategies deployed at Nuremberg reveal a complex interplay of legal reasoning, psychological self-protection, and ideological framing. Appeals to obedience, claims of ignorance, deflection of responsibility, and public-oriented advocacy illustrate the lengths to which individuals and their representatives went to preserve self-image and mitigate culpability. These approaches, while sometimes partially effective in shaping perception, were consistently challenged by rigorous evidence, cross-examination, and moral scrutiny, underscoring the tribunal's dual role in adjudicating both legal and ethical accountability. By analyzing these strategies, the trials offer enduring lessons on the interaction between law, psychology, and ideology. Defendants' attempts to excuse, justify, or deny their actions reveal the mechanisms by which ordinary and extraordinary individuals negotiate guilt and moral responsibility under authoritarian regimes. The careful scrutiny of these defenses provided the tribunal with a means of distinguishing between genuine ignorance and willful complicity, ensuring that the principles of justice were upheld even in the face of complex rationalizations and ideological pressures. As the Nuremberg trials advanced beyond the presentation of defenses, the spotlight turned decisively to the prosecution. The Allied prosecutors faced a monumental challenge, constructing a coherent, compelling case against individuals who had participated in an unprecedented series of crimes spanning multiple countries, military campaigns, and bureaucratic structures. Their task required meticulous organization, a deep understanding of both the law and history, and a strategic approach capable of translating mountains of evidence into a narrative that could withstand scrutiny from judges, defendants, and an international audience. The prosecution's approach reflected not only legal acumen but also the ethical imperative of documenting truth while navigating the complex political landscape of post-war Europe. The strategic framework of the prosecutors began with careful selection and categorization of evidence. Documents formed the backbone of the case, providing indisputable proof of orders, communications, and administrative decisions that linked defendants directly to criminal activity. These included signed decrees authorizing deportations, memoranda detailing forced labor allocations, military orders targeting civilian populations, and correspondence outlining policy implementation. By presenting these records chronologically and thematically, prosecutors could demonstrate patterns of intent, coordination, and awareness that countered claims of ignorance or coercion. Each document was meticulously authenticated and cross-referenced, ensuring that the evidence could withstand challenges to credibility or interpretation. Eyewitness testimony complemented the documentary record, providing a human dimension that underscored the real-world consequences of abstract orders. Survivors of concentration and labor camps, civilians from occupied territories, and even lower-ranking soldiers testified to the execution of policies that defendants sought to minimize or deny. These accounts were strategically deployed to illustrate both the scale of atrocities and the consistency of defendants' involvement. The prosecution carefully juxtaposed statements from survivors with documents and internal communications, creating an evidentiary web that exposed contradictions in defendants' claims of ignorance, obedience, or moral disengagement. Witnesses' narratives brought the machinery of mass violence into the courtroom in vivid detail, reinforcing the moral imperative underlying the prosecution's work. Cross-examination became one of the prosecution's most powerful tools, designed to probe inconsistencies, challenge rationalizations, and expose the mechanisms of systemic criminality. Defendants who had relied on denial or selective acknowledgement were confronted with precise evidence that undermined their claims. Goring, for instance, faced pointed questioning regarding his direct involvement in plundering occupied territories, forced labor programs, and the administration of concentration camp resources. Speer's carefully crafted narrative of partial ignorance was scrutinized through the presentation of memos, witness accounts, and his own prior statements, revealing gaps between professed understanding and documented knowledge. These moments of tension, often highly dramatic in the courtroom, highlighted the interplay between legal strategy and psychological pressure, as defendants were forced to reconcile personal narratives with incontrovertible evidence. The prosecutor's work was informed by both legal innovation and historical awareness. The charges of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity were unprecedented, requiring careful articulation of concepts, definitions, and applicability to individual defendants. Legal teams spent extensive time establishing the nexus between actions and intent, ensuring that the case demonstrated clear lines of responsibility. By structuring arguments to address both systemic crimes and individual accountability, the prosecution created a framework capable of encompassing the full spectrum of Nazi criminality. This dual approach, targeting the machinery of atrocity while isolating individual actions, was essential in countering defense claims that responsibility could be diffused or mitigated by hierarchy and circumstance. Ethical considerations were central to the prosecution's approach. Allied lawyers were acutely aware that the trials were not only legal proceedings, but also moral reckonings with history. They faced the dual obligation of exposing truth and establishing justice, while avoiding the appearance of victor's justice or political retribution. Careful attention was paid to ensure that evidence was presented accurately, testimony was elicited respectfully, and cross-examinations were rigorous without descending into intimidation or theatrics. The ethical responsibility extended beyond courtroom strategy. Prosecutors recognized that their work would shape historical understanding, influence post-war reconciliation, and contribute to the development of international law. Every piece of evidence, every line of questioning, was therefore deployed with both legal and moral purpose. Political pressures, both overt and subtle, complicated the prosecution's task. The trials were conducted in a context of geopolitical tension, with the Allied powers balancing the pursuit of justice against the emerging realities of post-war power dynamics. Legal arguments had to navigate sensitivities surrounding the Soviet, American, British, and French perspectives, while simultaneously addressing global scrutiny and domestic expectations. Prosecutors were careful to emphasize the universal nature of the crimes, rather than framing them as solely German or nationalist transgressions. This strategy was crucial for establishing the precedent of international law, that individuals, regardless of nationality or position, could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. The prosecution also made strategic use of visual evidence, understanding the persuasive power of images and physical documentation in conveying the human consequences of policy. Photographs of concentration camps, transportation networks, and scenes of mass execution were presented alongside administrative records to create a compelling narrative of both intent and outcome. Maps, charts, and diagrams helped illustrate the scale and coordination of operations, demonstrating the systematic nature of the crimes. These visual tools were not mere rhetorical devices. They functioned as corroborative evidence, bridging the gap between abstract orders and concrete consequences, and reinforcing the ethical imperative of accurately representing historical truth. A critical aspect of the prosecution's approach was the careful sequencing of testimony and evidence. Witnesses were often introduced in conjunction with corroborating documents, creating a layered narrative that guided judges and the public through complex events. For example, survivor testimony describing deportations might be immediately supported by transportation logs, orders signed by defendants, and photographs of affected areas. This meticulous orchestration ensured clarity, minimized ambiguity, and maximized the impact of evidence. Cross-examination further amplified these connections, forcing defendants to confront the full weight of documentation, human testimony, and historical records simultaneously. Ultimately, the prosecutor's approach reflected an intricate balancing act between legal strategy, historical accuracy, ethical responsibility, and political prudence. Their work demonstrated that constructing a case against individuals implicated in mass crimes required more than factual evidence. It required narrative coherence, psychological insight, and moral clarity. By integrating documents, eyewitness testimony, cross-examination, and visual evidence, prosecutors were able to establish both the scope of criminal operations and the personal culpability of defendants. This comprehensive strategy not only advanced the immediate goals of the tribunal, but also established enduring principles for the prosecution of crimes against humanity in subsequent international courts. The prosecution's meticulous methodology ensured that the trials were more than a punitive exercise. They became a blueprint for historical and legal reckoning. By systematically linking individual actions to systemic atrocities, demonstrating intent, and challenging rationalizations, the Allied lawyers created a record that would inform both jurisprudence and collective memory. Their careful attention to ethical responsibility, combined with strategic deployment of evidence and rigorous courtroom tactics, reinforced the legitimacy of the proceedings while illuminating the moral and psychological dimensions of complicity. Through these strategies, the tribunal succeeded in transforming a vast, complex, and often abstract series of wartime crimes into a coherent, compelling, and actionable legal case. The prosecutor's approach highlighted the necessity of evidence, the power of narrative, and the ethical imperatives inherent in documenting atrocities. By maintaining rigorous standards of proof, respecting the nuances of human behavior, and navigating political pressures, they established a model of accountability and justice that continues to influence international law and historical understanding. Following months of testimony, cross-examination, and presentation of overwhelming evidence, the Nuremberg Tribunal reached its verdicts, delivering judgments that would resonate across the world. The tribunal's decisions encompassed a spectrum of sentences, from death by hanging to long-term imprisonment, and in a few cases, acquittals. Each judgment reflected not only the individual defendant's level of culpability, but also the tribunal's interpretation of international law, moral responsibility, and the precedents it sought to establish for addressing crimes against humanity. The sentencing phase was both a legal conclusion and a symbolic moment, capturing the global determination to hold perpetrators accountable for acts of extraordinary brutality. 12 defendants received the ultimate penalty: death by hanging. Among these were high-ranking officials such as Joachim von Ribbentrop, who had served as foreign minister and played a central role in diplomatic negotiations that facilitated aggression and oppression, Wilhelm Keitel, whose military authority had been instrumental in executing campaigns involving mass civilian casualties, and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the RSHA and a key orchestrator of the final solution. The tribunal determined that these individuals' actions demonstrated direct responsibility, systematic participation, and moral culpability that left no room for mitigation. Their executions represented the court's firm stance that leadership positions entailed not only privilege and authority, but also accountability for the consequences of policy and action. Several other defendants received long-term imprisonment, ranging from 10 years to life sentences. These included figures like Albert Speer, who was sentenced to 20 years for his role in exploiting forced labor while largely avoiding direct involvement in extermination programs, and Baldur von Schirach, leader of the Hitler Youth, whose actions contributed to the indoctrination of German youth and complicity in crimes but fell short of direct orchestration. Prison sentences reflected a nuanced assessment of participation, acknowledging culpability while differentiating between degrees of involvement and intent. This approach allowed the tribunal to balance justice with proportionality, recognizing that responsibility existed along a spectrum even within the tightly hierarchical and ideologically driven structure of the Nazi regime. Acquittals, though relatively rare, were notable for the clarity with which the tribunal distinguished between legal responsibility and peripheral association. 3 defendants were acquitted, their cases demonstrating that absence of direct action, lack of evidence, or insufficient connection to criminal policy could absolve individuals under the tribunal's rigorous standards. These acquittals underscored the tribunal's commitment to fairness and legal integrity, signaling that the pursuit of justice required evidence-based judgment rather than blanket retribution. By including these outcomes, the tribunal affirmed the principle that punishment must be commensurate with verified responsibility, reinforcing the credibility of international legal proceedings. Public reaction to the sentences was immediate and intense. In Germany, opinions were sharply divided. Many civilians, still reeling from defeat and devastation, viewed the executions as just retribution for leaders they had come to blame for the collapse of the nation. Others, influenced by lingering nationalist sentiment or resentment toward Allied occupation, perceived the punishments as excessive or emblematic of victors' justice. Internationally, the sentences were generally lauded, particularly in countries that had endured Nazi occupation and suffered the atrocities firsthand. Survivors of concentration camps and forced labor systems often expressed relief and validation, seeing the judgments as acknowledgement of the immense suffering inflicted upon them and their communities. The public dimension of the verdicts highlighted the dual role of the tribunal, as both a legal institution and a moral arbiter whose decisions would shape collective memory. Debates over the fairness of the judgments emerged alongside praise. Critics argued that retroactively applying concepts such as crimes against humanity constituted ex post facto justice, while others questioned the selective prosecution of German leaders versus broader systemic participants. Some contended that political considerations influenced sentencing, citing the inclusion of some high-profile figures, while others evaded accountability due to escape, death, or Allied discretion. Supporters countered that the tribunal's meticulous procedures, evidentiary standards, and allowance for defense representation ensured legitimacy, even if the unprecedented nature of the trials inevitably involved interpretive challenges. These debates remain central to historical analysis, emphasizing the tension between legal innovation, moral imperative, and the realities of post-war geopolitics. The tribunal's rationale for each sentence provides insight into its balancing of law, morality, and history. Death sentences were reserved for individuals whose direct involvement in orchestrating atrocities left no doubt of both intent and effect. Long-term imprisonment accounted for active participation without the same level of personal initiative or moral responsibility. Acquittals reflected the tribunal's recognition of insufficient evidence or limited agency, demonstrating the importance of careful assessment even within a context of overwhelming collective crime. Each judgment, therefore, served as a calibration of accountability, reflecting both the individual's actions and the broader legal principles that the tribunal sought to enshrine. The moral and historical implications of these verdicts extended far beyond the courtroom. By holding leaders personally accountable, the tribunal established a precedent that political and military authority could not shield individuals from prosecution for crimes of extraordinary magnitude. The judgments conveyed a clear message that obedience to orders, bureaucratic efficiency, or ideological conformity did not absolve moral or legal responsibility. This principle would influence subsequent international law, including the development of conventions against genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, shaping the legal architecture for future tribunals in Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, and beyond. Sentences also carried profound symbolic significance. They represented the world's collective judgment on the moral failures of individuals who had enabled, directed, or facilitated genocide and mass violence. For survivors and the international community, the verdicts provided a form of moral closure, affirming that even in the face of vast systemic evil, justice could be articulated and enacted. The act of publicly naming, judging, and sentencing perpetrators reinforced the ethical principle that accountability is essential for both societal healing and the preservation of human dignity. The tribunal's careful attention to proportionality and differentiation further strengthened its legacy. By distinguishing between varying levels of culpability and tailoring sentences accordingly, the court avoided the pitfalls of indiscriminate punishment, instead fostering a model of justice rooted in evidence, deliberation, and ethical reasoning. This approach demonstrated that international law could address complex moral and operational hierarchies without resorting to arbitrary retribution, establishing a standard for both fairness and moral rigor in subsequent prosecutions. Historical analyses underscore that the judgments were not merely punitive but educational, creating a lasting record for scholars, policymakers, and the public. Each sentence, whether execution, imprisonment, or acquittal, was contextualized within detailed reasoning that explained the interplay of authority, ideology, action, and consequence. This reasoning provided a framework for understanding how ordinary and extraordinary individuals contributed to systemic atrocities, illuminating pathways of complicity, moral failure, and resistance. By embedding these lessons in legal precedent, the tribunal ensured that history itself would bear witness to both the crimes and the accountability measures that followed. In the broader international context, the Nuremberg verdicts established the principle that crimes transcending national boundaries could be subject to collective legal scrutiny. The proceedings demonstrated that sovereignty did not confer immunity when actions violated fundamental human rights, and that moral and legal standards could be codified and enforced across nations. This dual function, holding perpetrators accountable while establishing transnational legal norms, represents one of the tribunal's most enduring legacies, influencing both jurisprudence and the philosophical underpinnings of international justice. Ultimately, the world's verdict at Nuremberg was a convergence of law, morality, and history. The sentences, reflecting careful deliberation and evidence-based judgment, underscored the principle that individuals, regardless of rank or role, could not hide behind ideology, obedience, or circumstance when confronted with crimes against humanity. The tribunal balanced legal rigor with ethical responsibility, navigating political pressures and public expectations to produce judgments that remain instructive, precedent-setting, and morally resonant. By articulating the consequences of complicity, initiative, and inaction, the sentences delivered a message that continues to shape international law, historical understanding, and the global conception of justice. While the Nuremberg trials are often remembered for the high-profile defendants and their dramatic confessions, a wealth of insight emerged from the testimonies of mid- and low-level perpetrators whose roles were less publicly scrutinized. These individuals, often bureaucrats, camp administrators, or lower-ranking military officers, operated within the machinery of the Nazi state, executing orders that enabled atrocities on a vast scale. Their confessions, though lacking the notoriety of figures like Göring or Keitel, provided critical evidence of systemic complicity, revealing how ordinary people, acting within institutional frameworks, contributed to crimes against humanity. By examining these lesser-known testimonies, historians have gained a more nuanced understanding of the mechanisms of genocide and the moral choices, or lack thereof, made by individuals at all levels. Many of these defendants initially attempted to minimize their roles, emphasizing their positions as minor functionaries or claiming that their work was purely administrative. Railway clerks, for instance, described scheduling deportation trains without reference to the ultimate fate of the passengers. Office workers in ministry departments insisted that their duties were limited to paperwork or logistical coordination, framing themselves as neutral actors in a complex system. Yet cross-examination and documentary evidence often revealed otherwise, demonstrating that even small actions, processing transport lists, approving supplies, maintaining records, had direct consequences for the victims. These confessions highlighted a key principle. Systemic atrocities require not only ideologically driven leaders, but also the compliance and technical support of numerous ordinary participants. The confessions of mid-level perpetrators illuminated the cumulative effect of seemingly minor decisions. In testimonies from camp guards and administrators, it became clear that procedural adherence, following detailed instructions regarding food distribution, labor allocation, or prisoner categorization, was essential for the functioning of extermination and forced labor systems. Defendants often expressed a mixture of detachment and moral rationalization, portraying their actions as just following orders or necessary for the smooth operation of the bureaucracy. Yet their detailed recollections provided invaluable insight into the day-to-day implementation of genocide, revealing how the machinery of mass murder depended on the routine work of countless individuals who, in isolation, might appear unremarkable. Psychologically, these confessions shed light on the processes of moral disengagement. Lower-level perpetrators frequently described a combination of ideological conditioning, desensitization, and institutional pressure that enabled compliance. Many had been socialized into a worldview that dehumanized victims and framed obedience as a civic duty, internalizing propaganda that portrayed Jews, Romani people, and political dissidents as existential threats. In addition, the bureaucratic environment reinforced conformity. Routine, paperwork, and hierarchical supervision created a sense of inevitability, reducing the perceived weight of individual choice. Testimonies reveal that, within this context, many participants were able to compartmentalize responsibility, focusing on technical tasks while avoiding reflection on their moral implications. Some confessions were particularly striking for their candor about moral conflict. Mid-level officers occasionally admitted internal struggle or discomfort with orders, yet they continued to comply, illustrating the tension between personal conscience and systemic coercion. For instance, several camp clerks recounted awareness of the ultimate fate of prisoners but justified their participation as unavoidable due to threats, peer pressure, or the impossibility of changing the system from within. These reflections provide a powerful lens for understanding the banality of evil. Atrocities were executed not solely by zealots or fanatics, but by individuals who rationalized participation and normalized routine in a morally catastrophic environment. The confessions of industrial workers, supply managers, and technical specialists further underscored systemic complicity. Factories producing munitions or equipment for the military relied on forced labor, and personnel involved in procurement, quality control, or production planning were implicated in supporting the exploitation of prisoners. Testimonies from these individuals detailed processes, production quotas, and logistical coordination, revealing how economic and bureaucratic systems were harnessed to support ideological objectives. While these defendants might have viewed their contributions as technical or apolitical, their accounts made clear that efficiency, compliance, and technical expertise were integral to sustaining both the war effort and the machinery of genocide. Lesser-known confessions also emphasized the cumulative moral weight of ordinary actions. While the tribunal focused primarily on high-level decisions and orchestrators of atrocities, the detailed testimonies of lower-ranking participants revealed that each functionary, clerk, guard, or driver contributed to a network of accountability that enabled large-scale human suffering. Historians have noted that these accounts complicate simplistic narratives of villainy, demonstrating that responsibility was distributed across multiple layers of society, from planners to implementers to bystanders. By including these voices, the historical record captures the full scope of complicity, providing a richer and more precise understanding of how genocide was operationalized. In some cases, defendants offered explicit reflections on the human cost of their actions, sometimes expressing remorse or horror. Guards who had witnessed mass shootings, clerks who processed transport orders, and factory workers who oversaw forced labor conditions described moments of personal recognition of suffering, even when compliance continued. These candid insights contribute to the moral and psychological analysis of the trials, illustrating that awareness of wrongdoing did not always lead to resistance. The testimonies reveal the complex interplay between awareness, social pressure, and personal choice, emphasizing the ethical dilemmas faced by ordinary participants in extraordinary circumstances. The cumulative impact of these lesser-known confessions on historical understanding has been profound. They provide granular detail on how the Nazi system functioned, clarifying the operational realities of camps, factories, and military units. These accounts reveal the interdependence of ideology, bureaucracy, and human agency, showing that genocide was not solely the product of top-down orders, but also of widespread compliance and coordination. By documenting the experiences of mid- and low-level perpetrators, historians can trace the pathways through which systemic violence was implemented, deepening insight into both the scope and mechanics of atrocity. Furthermore, these testimonies illuminate the ethical landscape of the time, demonstrating how individuals navigated moral, social, and professional pressures. They offer enduring lessons about the capacity for ordinary people to participate in extraordinary crimes, the mechanisms of moral disengagement, and the importance of institutional and social structures in shaping behavior. By incorporating these voices into the historical narrative, the trials provided a more complete picture of complicity, extending accountability beyond headline-grabbing figures to the many individuals whose actions, however seemingly minor, were essential to the functioning of a genocidal system. Ultimately, the lesser-known confessions of mid- and low-level perpetrators underscore critical truth revealed by the Nuremberg trials. The machinery of atrocity depends on both extraordinary criminal intent and ordinary participation. These testimonies demonstrate that systemic crimes are sustained not only by leaders and ideologues, but also by countless individuals whose compliance, technical skill, and bureaucratic diligence enable the execution of destructive policies. In illuminating the role of these individuals, the trials enriched historical understanding, strengthened moral and legal analysis, and emphasized the necessity of accountability at all levels of participation. By highlighting these voices, the tribunal ensured that the historical record encompassed not only the actions of notorious leaders, but also the broader societal networks that made genocide possible. The confessions of lesser-known perpetrators reveal the interlocking dynamics of ideology, obedience, and everyday compliance, offering enduring lessons for scholars, policymakers, and the public. In doing so, they complement the more famous testimonies, presenting a complete and sobering portrait of complicity, moral choice, and the human dimensions of systemic evil. In the years following the conclusion of the Nuremberg trials, the psychological aftermath for defendants became an important dimension of historical and moral inquiry. Individuals who had been central figures in one of history's most infamous regimes were left to confront not only legal punishment, but also the enduring weight of guilt, both internal and externally imposed. Many of the high-ranking officials who had once wielded immense authority faced a profound dissonance between their self-perception and the condemnation rendered by the tribunal and the broader international community. Their reflections, sometimes articulated in memoirs, post-trial interviews, or casual statements, offer crucial insight into the complex interplay of ideology, obedience, and personal conscience. For some, guilt was expressed overtly, accompanied by a degree of contrition. Albert Speer, in particular, became known for his candid acknowledgement of involvement in the Nazi war machine. While he claimed ignorance of the full extent of the Holocaust's operational execution, he accepted responsibility for his administrative and technical contributions, emphasizing the ethical consequences of bureaucratic complicity. His memoirs, which became widely read, reflect a deeply introspective engagement with questions of morality and responsibility, offering scholars and the public a rare window into the cognitive processes of a participant in mass atrocities. These reflections demonstrated an awareness of wrongdoing and a willingness, albeit partial, to confront the consequences of one's actions, setting him apart from other defendants who remained largely unrepentant. Other defendants exhibited a more ambivalent or defensive posture. Some rationalized their conduct through the lens of obedience or ideology, framing actions as duties necessitated by the wartime environment or loyalty to the Nazi Party. In interviews conducted years later, figures such as Göring continued to assert that their behavior was justified by legal authority, military necessity, or political obligation, offering insight into the mechanisms by which individuals reconcile morally questionable conduct with self-perception. These rationalizations, though legally insufficient to absolve responsibility, reveal the enduring psychological strategies employed to manage guilt and maintain a sense of identity post-conviction. Memoirs and interviews, however, were not limited to high-ranking figures. Lesser-known participants, particularly mid- and low-level functionaries, provided candid reflections that emphasized the banality of participation and the normalization of violence. Many acknowledged moral conflicts experienced during service, yet also described the powerful social, institutional, and ideological pressures that facilitated ongoing compliance. Former camp administrators, clerks, and industrial personnel detailed the cognitive compartmentalization necessary to maintain routine in environments saturated with atrocity. These accounts are particularly valuable for understanding how ordinary individuals engaged in bureaucratic, logistical, or operational roles could contribute to mass crimes while avoiding sustained moral reckoning at the time. Historical analysis of these confessions has been instrumental in shaping the broader understanding of both individual and systemic responsibility. Scholars have examined the narratives to trace patterns of obedience, rationalization, and moral disengagement, contributing to psychological and sociological studies of authoritarianism and human behavior in extreme conditions. The juxtaposition of detailed personal testimony with documentary evidence illuminates the mechanisms by which ordinary and extraordinary actors alike participated in criminal enterprises, offering lessons that extend beyond the specific historical context of World War II. These insights form the basis for educational curricula, psychological research, and comparative studies of genocide and mass violence in subsequent decades. Public memory has played a central role in amplifying the impact of these reflections. Museums, memorials, and educational programs have incorporated defendants' post-trial statements to highlight not only the scale of atrocities but also the human dimensions of complicity. By presenting both high-profile and lesser-known testimonies, public education emphasizes the spectrum of moral choice, reinforcing the principle that systemic atrocities require the participation of many individuals at multiple levels. Exhibitions often juxtapose bureaucratic documents, photographs, and survivor accounts with excerpts from memoirs and interviews, allowing audiences to witness the interplay between ideology, obedience, and personal responsibility. This approach ensures that collective memory captures both the horror of events and the human decisions that enabled them. Education has also drawn heavily on the psychological lessons embedded in these confessions. Studies of obedience, indoctrination, and moral disengagement, inspired by the testimonies of defendants, have informed pedagogy aimed at cultivating critical thinking, ethical reasoning, and awareness of social influence. The enduring relevance of these lessons is evident in curricula addressing civic responsibility, human rights, and the mechanisms of authoritarianism. By examining both the actions of individuals and the structural conditions that facilitated compliance, students and scholars are encouraged to reflect on how ideology, authority, and social pressures shape moral choice. The confessions further underscore the importance of narrative in the construction of historical understanding. Memoirs, interviews, and post-trial reflections allow historians to trace the evolution of defendants' perceptions over time, revealing shifts in self-perception, acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and moral reasoning. For example, initial post-trial statements often emphasized procedural fairness or claims of innocence, while later memoirs and interviews reflected deeper engagement with ethical considerations and the consequences of participation. This temporal dimension illuminates the ongoing process of reckoning, demonstrating that historical and moral understanding is rarely immediate but evolves as individuals confront the weight of their actions and as society continues to interpret their significance. One of the most striking lessons from these reflections is the fragility and malleability of moral judgment under conditions of systemic coercion. Defendants' accounts illustrate how ordinary individuals can be drawn into extraordinary crimes, often without overt malice, but through a combination of social pressure, ideological conditioning, and bureaucratic normalization. These insights have had profound implications for the study of human behavior, reinforcing psychological theories regarding authority, conformity, and ethical disengagement. The testimony of those who lived through the period, both as perpetrators and witnesses, provides a nuanced framework for understanding the ethical and moral dilemmas inherent in hierarchical, ideologically driven systems. The broader societal impact of these reflections is evident in ongoing discussions about accountability, reconciliation, and historical memory. By documenting both the actions and the post-facto moral reasoning of defendants, the trials established a comprehensive record that enables societies to confront difficult questions about obedience, complicity, and the responsibilities of individuals within systems of power. Memorials and educational programs incorporate these narratives to understand the dangers of uncritical adherence to authority, the ethical imperative of moral discernment, and the consequences of ideological indoctrination. The public engagement with these reflections ensures that lessons drawn from the trials remain relevant for subsequent generations. The enduring importance of post-trial reflections lies not only in understanding past atrocities, but also in preventing their recurrence. By integrating psychological insights, historical documentation, and moral analysis, these confessions highlight the interplay between human behavior and systemic structures. The ethical and practical lessons derived from defendants' reflections inform contemporary debates on human rights, international law, and civic responsibility. They provide a model for analyzing modern contexts in which authority, ideology, and bureaucracy intersect, emphasizing vigilance, critical thinking, and ethical accountability. Ultimately, the reflections on guilt and memory constitute a crucial complement to the legal proceedings themselves. They reveal the human dimension behind the tribunal's verdicts, providing insight into how individuals internalized, rationalized, or resisted moral responsibility. Memoirs, interviews, and historical analysis collectively illuminate the psychological aftermath of participation in atrocities, illustrating both the persistence of moral reasoning and the mechanisms of self-justification. By examining these reflections, historians, educators, and the public gain a deeper understanding of the conditions that fostered complicity, the challenges of ethical decision-making in hierarchical systems, and the enduring significance of moral accountability. These insights underscore the broader lesson of Nuremberg. Understanding atrocity requires more than documenting acts of violence. It necessitates engagement with the psychological, ideological, and moral landscapes that enable human beings to participate in, or resist, systemic evil. Defendants' reflections on guilt and memory illuminate these landscapes, demonstrating that the legacy of the trials extends beyond legal precedent into the realm of ethical and historical consciousness. Through these post-trial testimonies, society gains a multidimensional understanding of obedience, ideology, and moral responsibility, lessons that remain vital in educating future generations and preventing the recurrence of atrocities. The confessions of German defendants during the Nuremberg trials left an indelible mark not only on the legal and historical record of World War II, but also on the broader evolution of international law and moral consciousness. By detailing the personal, bureaucratic, and operational roles played by individuals in the orchestration of atrocities, these testimonies provided a foundational understanding of accountability that transcended national boundaries. The trial room became a space where law, ethics, and human experience intersected, and the confessions offered a template for how societies might confront crimes of extraordinary scale while maintaining a rigorous commitment to legal and moral principles. One of the most significant legacies of these confessions is their influence on the development of international law. The Nuremberg trials established unprecedented legal precedents by codifying concepts such as crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The testimonies of defendants, whether acknowledging responsibility or attempting to minimize it, provided the evidentiary and moral foundation for these definitions. Lawyers, judges, and policymakers drew from these accounts to articulate the principle that individuals, regardless of position or rank, could not evade responsibility for participation in systematic atrocities. This legal framework laid the groundwork for subsequent international tribunals, including those addressing genocide in Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, and, more recently, the establishment of the International Criminal Court. By illustrating both individual and systemic culpability, the confessions shaped a universal standard that human rights violations and acts of mass violence warrant accountability under international law. Human rights discourse has been deeply informed by these narratives. The confessions revealed how ideological indoctrination, bureaucratic normalization, and obedience to authority facilitated the perpetration of crimes against humanity. By analyzing these mechanisms, scholars and practitioners of human rights have gained a clearer understanding of the conditions that enable mass violence and the safeguards required to prevent recurrence. The trials demonstrated that legal codification alone is insufficient. Moral awareness, education, and vigilance against systemic pressures are essential complements to enforceable norms. This insight has informed global human rights initiatives, emphasizing both structural accountability and the cultivation of individual ethical responsibility in governance, military conduct, and civic life. The confessions also retain relevance in contemporary conflicts and the ongoing pursuit of accountability. Modern tribunals often rely on detailed witness statements, internal communications, and participant testimonies to establish patterns of criminal behavior. The procedural and evidentiary lessons derived from Nuremberg, particularly the systematic cross-referencing of personal narratives with documentary evidence, remain central to ensuring credibility and fairness in adjudicating contemporary war crimes. For example, tribunals addressing atrocities in Bosnia, Rwanda, and other regions have applied methods that echo the meticulous approach pioneered at Nuremberg, drawing directly from the insights gained through defendants' testimonies. By demonstrating how individual actions connect to broader systemic crimes, these confessions continue to inform both legal methodology and moral reasoning in the prosecution of mass violence. Beyond law and policy, the confessions have profoundly shaped collective memory of World War II. They provide a human dimension to historical understanding, illustrating how ordinary and extraordinary individuals engaged in, rationalized, or resisted participation in atrocities. Museums, memorials, and educational programs integrate excerpts from these testimonies to convey the lived experience of the perpetrators, complementing survivor narratives to create a fuller picture of the era. By including both prominent leaders and lesser-known functionaries, public memory emphasizes that the machinery of atrocity required broad participation, and that understanding history demands attention to multiple levels of agency. This nuanced remembrance fosters critical reflection on the conditions that allow systemic violence to flourish and encourages ongoing vigilance against its resurgence. The confessions also contribute to ethical and philosophical discourse, providing enduring lessons about obedience, ideology, and moral responsibility. By revealing the ways individuals navigated hierarchical, bureaucratic, and ideological pressures, the testimonies illustrate the fragility of ethical judgment under systemic coercion. Educational programs frequently highlight these psychological dimensions, encouraging students, leaders, and policymakers to reflect on the moral implications of authority, conformity, and complicity. The Nuremberg Confessions thereby serve as both historical documentation and moral pedagogy, guiding contemporary audiences in understanding how ordinary people can become agents of extraordinary harm, and how moral courage and critical thinking are essential defenses against systemic evil. Another dimension of their legacy is the precedent they set for transparency and historical record-keeping. By recording, publishing, and analyzing these testimonies, the tribunal ensured that perpetrators' perspectives, whether honest, evasive, or manipulative, were preserved for posterity. Historians, legal scholars, and psychologists have been able to study the interplay between personal narrative, institutional structure, and moral reasoning with unprecedented depth. This archival approach ensures that future generations have access to primary evidence of both atrocity and accountability, supporting the dual aims of historical accuracy and ethical reflection. The confessions remain invaluable resources for understanding the mechanisms of war crimes, the psychology of perpetrators, and the ethical challenges inherent in addressing systemic violence. The confessions also illustrate the enduring tension between justice and memory. They highlight the challenge of balancing legal accountability with broader societal reconciliation and historical understanding. By acknowledging both high-profile and lower-level participants, the Nuremberg record underscores the complexity of assigning responsibility while preserving a narrative that educates without oversimplifying. This tension continues to inform contemporary approaches to transitional justice, where tribunals, truth commissions, and educational initiatives must navigate the dual goals of holding individuals accountable and fostering collective understanding. In this sense, The lessons derived from these testimonies extend far beyond their immediate historical context, offering guidance on how societies confront the legacies of atrocity. Finally, the confessions serve as a moral compass for humanity. They demonstrate that the human capacity for compliance, rationalization, and moral disengagement can be extraordinarily powerful, yet they also highlight the enduring importance of reflection, conscience, and ethical courage. By confronting the narratives of perpetrators alongside the suffering of victims, contemporary audiences are reminded that accountability is both a legal and moral imperative. The Nuremberg Confessions reinforce the principle that individuals are never entirely absolved by hierarchy, ideology, or circumstance, and that the vigilant defense of human rights requires constant attention to the lessons of history. In summation, the legacy of these confessions is multifaceted, encompassing law, human rights, collective memory, and ethical reflection. They provided a foundation for modern international jurisprudence, shaped the way societies remember and teach about World War II, and continue to inform responses to contemporary atrocities. By recording the voices of those who participated in systemic crimes, the Nuremberg trials created a comprehensive framework for understanding the interplay of individual action, structural power, and moral responsibility. These lessons remain essential for ensuring that future generations recognize the importance of ethical vigilance, historical understanding, and accountability in preventing the recurrence of mass violence.